Every single one of them vanished from open ground. Not from dense forest where visibility collapses to 10 feet. Not from a whiteout. Not from a river crossing gone wrong. Open ground. The kind of terrain where a trooper standing at the tree line can see half a mile in every direction and still find nothing. No tracks leading away. No gear scattered in a pattern that suggests panic. Just a person who was there and then was not. The trooper who worked these cases spent 31 years in the Alaskan wilderness. He documented more death than most people will ever be adjacent to. He kept his private notes in a green notebook he never showed anyone. 3 of the 5 came back alive. That should be the reassuring part. It is not, because of what they said when they did. He wrote those words in capital letters and underlined them twice. This is what he found. My name is not important. What is important is that I spent 31 years doing a job that most people in the lower 48 have no frame of reference for. I was an Alaska State Trooper assigned to the interior wilderness zones, which sounds official and contained until you understand what that actually means on the ground. It means you are the only law enforcement presence in an area the size of some European countries. It means when a call comes in, you are not 3 minutes away. You are sometimes 3 hours away. And that is if the weather holds and the aircraft is available and nothing else is on fire at the same time. It means you learn very quickly that the wilderness does not care about your training, your equipment, or your certainty. It has its own rules, and it applies them without apology. And I extracted bodies from rivers so cold the water had already done half the coroner's work. I airlifted hunters off ridgelines in November darkness with one hand on the stretcher and one eye on the fuel gauge. I sat with people who had watched their partners die and could not explain how, not because they were in shock, but because what happened genuinely did not have an explanation that fit any category either of us knew. I was not a man who frightened easily. I was not a man who reached for the supernatural when the procedural would do. I filed clean reports, I documented what could be documented, and I left out what could not be verified. That is the point. That is exactly the point. Because there are 5 cases in 31 years that I could not verify, could not explain, and could not in good conscience put into any official file without being either laughed out of the department or quietly reassigned somewhere without field work. So I did what any careful, stubborn, methodical man does with information he cannot use professionally. I kept it myself. Green notebook, bottom drawer, 31 years. The first case I wrote in it was 1994. I did not know then that it was the first of 5. I thought it was an anomaly, a one-time thing, the kind of case every trooper has once in a career and quietly carries home. It was not until the 3rd case that I understood what I was looking at. That understanding did not make me feel better. It made me feel like I needed to start writing things down very carefully before I forgot a single detail. So I did. The first case opened in August of 1994. So I've read that entry so many times the page has softened at the edges. It begins the way all the others begin, with a person who knew exactly what they were doing. The first entry in the notebook is dated August 14th, 1994. The man's name was Gerald Pelham. He was 52 years old, a land surveyor out of Anchorage with 26 years of solo fieldwork across the state. He knew what he was doing. That is the first thing I want you to understand about every single one of these cases. These were not inexperienced people who wandered off a marked trail and got turned around in the dark. Gerald Pelham had worked terrain twice as remote and half as forgiving, as the stretch of open tundra north of the farewell area where he disappeared. He had the right gear, the right experience, and a check-in schedule with his company that he had never once missed in 26 years of fieldwork. He missed it on August 12th. I got the call the following morning after his company spent 12 hours trying to reach him by every channel they had. Standard missing person protocol. I flew out with a search partner, a pilot named Cruz, who had been doing bushwork since before I joined the department, and we ran the standard grid from his last known GPS position outward. The terrain was open tundra, flat with low brush, good visibility in every direction for at least a mile from his campsite. His tent was standing. His equipment was packed and organized as if he had been in the middle of a normal working day and simply stepped away for a moment. His GPS unit was on the ground beside his pack, powered on, showing his position correctly. His rifle was leaning against the tent. His satellite communicator was inside, battery full, showing no outgoing messages after 6 p.m. on August 11th. Cruz looked at me and said exactly what I was thinking. He didn't leave in a hurry. No, he didn't leave at all, by the look of it. There were no tracks leading away from the campsite. I want to be precise about that because it is the detail that stopped me cold and kept me stopped for the better part of an hour. The ground around the tent was soft enough to hold impressions. I could see where Gerald had walked back and forth between his tent and his survey markers. I could see the impression of where he had sat. His boot prints were clear and readable in the soft earth around the camp perimeter. They stopped at the edge of the camp, not gradually. Not as if he had stepped onto harder ground and the tracks became faint. They stopped as if Gerald Pelham had walked to the edge of his campsite and ceased to exist. We found him on the third day, 11 miles northeast of the campsite, standing in the middle of an open field with his arms at his sides and his face pointing roughly northwest. He was wearing everything he had been wearing when he disappeared. His boots were tied. He was not hypothermic, not dehydrated beyond what 3 days without food and minimal water would explain, and not physically injured in any way that either the field medic or the hospital in Anchorage could document. He was also completely unresponsive, not unconscious. His eyes were open. He was breathing normally. His pupils reacted to light. He was standing under his own balance. But when I put my hand on his shoulder and said his name, nothing happened. When I walked around in front of him and held my flashlight up, his eyes did not track the light. He was present in every biological sense and absent in every other. He came back over the following 48 hours, gradually, the way someone surfaces from a very deep sleep. By the time the doctors in Anchorage were satisfied with his vitals and his basic cognitive function, he was speaking normally, eating, recognizing his wife when she arrived. He had no memory of anything after 6 p.m. on August 11th. Not the disappearance, not the 3 days, not standing in that field. Nothing. I interviewed him twice. The first time, 4 days after we found him. The second time, 3 weeks later when he had been home and rested and had some distance from the immediate shock of it. Both times he told me the same thing, and he remembered finishing his notes for the day, heating water for dinner, and then nothing. No transition, no sense of time passing. Just the hospital and his wife's face, and a feeling he struggled to describe and finally put this way. Like I had been looked at, very thoroughly, and then set back down. I wrote that in the notebook later that night, in the margin, because I did not know where else to put it. I filed a clean report. Exposure, possible brief dissociative episode consistent with isolation stress, no evidence of third-party involvement. The department was satisfied. Gerald Pelham eventually went back to work, though not to solo field work. And as far as I know, he lived out the rest of his life without incident. But 6 weeks after we found him, I went back to that field alone. I told myself I was closing out the case, making sure I had not missed anything in the initial search. I was lying to myself, and I knew it, but I went anyway. The field was empty and quiet and exactly as I remembered it. Flat ground, low brush, nothing remarkable in any direction. Except that in the center of the field, in the approximate area where Gerald had been standing, there was a circle of small stones, smooth river stones, none of them larger than a fist, arranged in a ring perhaps 4 feet across. They had not been there when we found him. I was certain of that because I had walked that exact ground myself. There was no river within 11 miles. I stood there for a long time looking at those stones. Then I went back to my aircraft, flew home, and opened a new notebook. Gerald Pelham was the first entry. 3 years passed before the second case. 3 years of ordinary work, ordinary reports, ordinary explanations. I had almost convinced myself that Gerald Pelham was the anomaly I had originally thought he was. Then, October of 1997 arrived, and a man named Raymond Stuckey did not come home on Thursday with meat in his truck and mud on his boots. Raymond established himself as one of those men the wilderness produces occasionally. The kind who moves through remote country the way most people move through their own neighborhood. Comfortable, unhurried. Oriented in a way that seems almost biological rather than learned. His full name was Raymond Stuckey. He was 61 years old when he disappeared in October of 1997. And he had been hunting moose in the same general region of the Alaska Range for 30 years without a single incident worth reporting. His wife Carol told me that when she dropped him at the trailhead on the morning of October 3rd, he had laughed at her when she reminded him to check in daily. "Carol, I have been walking into that country since before you knew my name. I will be home Thursday with meat in the truck and mud on my boots, same as always." She paused when she told me that. Then she said quietly, he was right every other time. He checked in the evening of October 3rd. He did not check in on October 4th. By October 5th, Carol had called it in, and I was airborne. What followed was the largest search operation I personally ran in 31 years. 14 days, 412 square miles of coverage between aircraft, ground teams, and volunteer searchers from 3 surrounding communities. We had good weather for the first week, which in October in the Alaska Range means you take it and you move fast because it will not last. We moved fast. We covered the ground he knew, the ground adjacent to it, and the ground beyond that in every direction his experience and his physical condition would have allowed him to reach. We found nothing. Not nothing as in no body, nothing as in no trace, no camp, no gear, no food cache, no shell casings from a shot taken at game, no boot prints on any soft ground in the entire search area. Raymond Stuckey walked into the Alaska Range on the morning of October 3rd, checked in once, and disappeared from the physical world without leaving a single mark. I have run searches where experienced people died and left almost nothing. Hypothermia in open terrain, a fall into water that moves fast enough to carry a body miles before anything surfaces. I understand how the wilderness can reduce evidence to almost zero. But almost zero and absolute zero are different things. And in 14 days of searching, we found absolute zero. Except for one thing. On day 9, working a grid about 7 miles northeast of his last known check-in position, and I came across a small circle of stones in a patch of open ground between 2 stands of spruce. Smooth stones, arranged carefully, a ring about 4 feet across. I photographed it, measured it, collected 2 of the stones for the file. I noted the location precisely. That evening, I sat in the search base tent and looked at those photographs for a long time. Then I went to the bottom of my pack and took out the notebook. I had not written in it since Gerald Pelham 3 years earlier. I read that entry again. I looked at the photographs again. The stones in the 2 circles were not identical. The terrain was different. The circumstances were different. But the ring was the same diameter, the same careful arrangement, the same smooth stones that had no business being in either location. I did not put this in the official report. I want to be honest about that. I told myself there was insufficient evidence to connect the 2 cases, which was technically true. I told myself I was protecting the integrity of the investigation from speculation, which was professionally reasonable. But the real reason was simpler and less flattering. I did not write it in the report because I did not know what to do with it. And a thing you do not know what to do with has no place in an official file. I wrote it in the notebook instead. Carol Stuckey called me every month for the first year after Raymond disappeared. Not to ask for updates, because there were none, and she was a practical woman who understood that. She called because she needed to talk to someone who had stood in that country looking for her husband and could confirm that the looking had been real and thorough, and I always took her calls. In one of those calls, about 4 months after the disappearance, I described the stone circle without telling her what I thought it meant. I just described it and asked if it meant anything to her, if Raymond had any habit or practice of arranging stones as trail markers or camp indicators. She was quiet for long enough that I thought the line had dropped. Raymond would never do that. He had a thing about disturbing natural terrain. He wouldn't move a stone from where it was sitting. He thought it was disrespectful. Another pause. Then she said, "Where did you say you found it?" I told her the coordinates. That's almost 8 miles from where he camped the first night. He wouldn't have gone that direction. There's nothing that way he would have been hunting. I thanked her and wrote that in the notebook too. 6 months after the disappearance, in April of 1998, a trapper named Willoughby, working a line about 12 miles northeast of the original search area, called the department to report something he had found and did not know what to do with. I drove out to meet him at a roadside pullout because he did not want to discuss it on the radio, and I respected that instinct. He was a quiet man, 60 or so, with the specific economy of movement that long winters alone produce. He did not dramatize what he told me. He simply said that he had come across a rifle standing upright in the snow in the middle of a clearing. No footprints anywhere around it. The snow undisturbed in every direction, as if the rifle had descended from the sky and planted itself barrel down in the drift. It was Raymond Stuckey's rifle. I confirmed that from the serial number that same afternoon. It was clean. It was loaded. The safety was off. Raymond Stuckey's case is still listed as open in the department files. The rifle is in an evidence locker in Anchorage. Carol passed away in 2019. She never got an answer. Neither did I. 6 years separated the second case from the third. 6 years during which I carried those 2 entries in the notebook like stones in a coat pocket, always present, never useful. When the third case arrived, it arrived differently. This time there was a survivor. This time someone came back and tried to tell me what had happened to them. What she said changed the weight of everything I had written before it. Her name was Dr. Nadia Voss. She was 38 years old, a wildlife biologist contracted through the University of Fairbanks to conduct a solo caribou population census in a remote section of the Kuskokwim Mountains. She had a doctorate, 8 years of solo fieldwork across 3 continents, and a personality her department supervisor described to me as pathologically methodical. His words, not mine, and he meant them as a compliment. She checked in every evening at 6 p.m. without exception. Her supervisor told me this was not a requirement of the contract. It was something Nadia had established herself on her first day in the field, because she believed that a person working alone in remote terrain owed it to the people who cared about her to be predictable. She had done it for 11 consecutive evenings before she did not do it on the 12th. Her supervisor waited until 7 p.m., which he said was the longest hour of his life, and then he called us. I was at her last GPS position by noon the following day. The campsite was in a shallow valley between two low ridges. Good shelter from wind, clean sight lines in 3 directions. She had chosen it well. Everything about the way she had set up and maintained her camp told me I was looking at someone who was precise and careful and experienced in exactly the way the job required. The tent was standing. The sleeping bag was spread open, as if she had gotten up in the morning and not yet straightened it. Her field notebooks were stacked on the small folding table she had set up inside, open to the current page. Her last entry dated the previous evening at 5:47 p.m., 13 minutes before she should have made her call. The entry was routine. Weather observations, a caribou count from the afternoon, a note about a change in wind direction she wanted to track the following day. It ended mid-sentence, the pen lying across the page as if set down for a moment. On the small camp stove outside the tent, a pot of water had been heated, cooled, and reheated enough times by the afternoon sun that it had partially evaporated. She had been in the middle of making dinner. Her satellite phone was on the tent floor beside the sleeping bag. I picked it up. Full battery. No outgoing calls after 5:47 p.m. Both her boots were neatly placed just inside the tent entrance, side by side, toes pointing out. I stood in that campsite for a long time before I said anything. My search partner that day was a younger trooper named Garrett, who had been with the department about 4 years. He walked the perimeter twice, came back, and looked at me. There are no tracks out. I know. I mean, none. The ground is soft all the way to the ridge in every direction. Nothing. I know, Garrett. He looked at the boots. He looked at me. He did not say what he was thinking, and I did not either. And we got to work. We found her on the 4th day. She was standing in a clearing 8 miles northeast of the campsite, which is a significant distance to cover in 4 days across that terrain, particularly without boots. Her feet should have been destroyed. They were not. There were superficial abrasions consistent with walking on rough ground, the kind of minor damage you would expect from a barefoot walk across a parking lot, while not 8 miles of Kuskokwim mountain terrain. The examining physician noted this twice in his report and then did not comment on it further because there was nothing useful to say. She was in the same clothes she had been wearing when she disappeared. They were dirty but not torn, not damaged in any way that suggested a fall or a struggle. She was mildly dehydrated. Her temperature was lower than it should have been, but not in the clinical hypothermia range. She was standing with her arms loose at her sides and her face pointed slightly upward, toward the tree line at the northern edge of the clearing. She was unresponsive. She came back over about 36 hours, faster than Gerald Pelham had. And when she did, she was sharp and articulate and deeply distressed by the gap in her memory. She was a scientist. The absence of data where data should exist was, for her, a specific kind of torment. She went over and over the last entry in her field notebook, trying to find something in those final routine observations that would give her a thread to pull. There was nothing to pull. I interviewed her twice before she was transferred to a psychiatric evaluation facility in Anchorage, standard procedure for cases involving extended unresponsive states. What she reported to the evaluating psychologist, unprompted on the 2nd day of evaluation, was documented in a summary forwarded to my department 6 weeks after Nadia Voss was discharged and sent home to her family in Oregon. I read it once at my desk. Then I read it again. Then I went to my truck, sat in the parking lot for about 10 minutes, doing nothing in particular. Came back inside, and took the notebook out of the bottom drawer. What Nadia Voss told the psychologist, in her own careful and precise scientific language, was that she had a fragmented sensory impression. Not a memory exactly, but something that existed just below the threshold of memory, of lights. Multiple lights, moving in a way she could only describe as organic, not mechanical, not fixed. She said they moved the way something moves when it is breathing. She said she did not know if she had seen them with her eyes or perceived them some other way. She said the distinction had started to feel less important the more she thought about it. I wrote that in the notebook in capital letters. Because Gerald Pelham, sitting in a hospital bed in Anchorage 4 years earlier, had used a different word for a similar thing. He had said he felt looked at, thoroughly, and then set back down. Nadia Voss had never met Gerald Pelham. She had never heard his name. She had no access to his case file or his interview transcripts. She was describing the same thing. 2 witnesses, 2 separate years, 2 remote locations with nothing connecting them except a circle of stones and a description of something that breathes like light. I sat with that for a long time. Then the 4th case arrived, and it arrived with 2 witnesses at once, which should have given me twice the clarity. It gave me something else entirely. The 4th case is the only one involving 2 people, which should have made it easier to understand. 2 witnesses, 2 accounts, 2 sets of observations from trained, experienced professionals who had spent years reading wilderness terrain and making sound decisions inside it. In every practical sense, it should have been the most documented, most corroborated, most explainable case in the notebook. It was not. The guides were named Patrick Eller and Dennis Coho, both in their 40s, both with over 15 years of wilderness guiding experience in the interior, both certified and respected within the industry. They were leading a group of 6 clients on a 10-day backcountry expedition in late August of 2003. Experienced clients themselves, not tourists. The kind of group where everyone in it knows what they are doing, and the guides are more logistics coordinators than babysitters. On the afternoon of day 7, Patrick and Dennis told the group they were going to scout a connecting trail about 2 miles ahead before committing the whole group to it. Standard practice. They said they would be back within 90 minutes. They were gone for 6 hours. The clients searched. These were not people who panicked or stood around waiting for someone else to make a decision. They organized, split into pairs, covered the ground in the direction the guides had gone, and found nothing. No tracks, no gear, no response to calls. One of the clients, a retired search and rescue coordinator from Montana, told me later that in 30 years of wilderness work, he had never seen terrain simply swallow 2 experienced men in the way that terrain had swallowed Patrick and Dennis. They returned at 12 minutes past midnight, coming in from the northeast, which was roughly opposite the direction they had originally headed. They walked into camp without explanation, sat down near the fire, and said very little. Patrick asked if there was food. Dennis sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the ground. The clients fed them and asked no immediate questions, reading correctly that whatever had happened required some space before it could be discussed. I was called the following morning. I reached the group's position by early afternoon. Patrick Eller had already left. He had told the clients at first light that he was resigning from the expedition, effective immediately. He had packed his personal gear, radioed for an emergency extraction, and was gone before I was airborne. I was told he flew directly to Anchorage, collected his vehicle from long-term parking, drove home, put his house on the market inside a week, and relocated to somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. I was never able to conduct a formal interview. He did not respond to any of my attempts at contact. I do not entirely blame him for that, having eventually heard what I heard from Dennis. Dennis Coho stayed, finished the expedition, got the clients out safely, filed the standard incident report with the company, which described a navigation error and temporary disorientation. I interviewed him 3 days after the group came out. He's in a diner in Talkeetna because he did not want to talk in any official setting, and I respected that enough to drive the distance. He was a composed man, quiet in the way that wilderness work makes some people quiet, economical with words, comfortable with silence. He drank his coffee and looked out the window for a while before he started talking. And when he did, he talked steadily and without drama, which made what he said considerably harder to dismiss. We found the trail without any problem, marked it, turned around, started back. And then the light changed. I asked him what he meant by that. Not the weather, not clouds. The light itself changed, like the air had a different quality to it all of a sudden. Pat stopped walking, and I stopped behind him, and we just stood there for a second looking at it. And then we weren't there anymore. I asked him to explain what he meant by that. I mean, we were somewhere else. Not lost, not disoriented. Somewhere that was not the trail we had been standing on. Different ground, different tree line. And it was not dark, which it should have been by then. I asked what he remembered about the place they were in. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he had decided to stop. Then he said, "There was something there with us. More than one something." I could not see them directly. Every time I tried to look at one directly, it was somewhere else when I got my eyes to where it had been. But they were there. Both of us knew they were there. Pat knew. I could hear it in his breathing. I asked what they did. Nothing. There was nothing to do. We just stood there for what felt like maybe 20 minutes, and it was 6 hours. He stopped talking. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the window. "Dennis, what else?" He shook his head slowly, not an angry shake, not evasive. The shake of a man who has reached the exact boundary of what language can do for him and knows it. I cannot say the rest. I have tried to say it to myself, and it does not come out as words. It just comes out as the feeling it left behind. He never said another word about it, but what he had said was enough. I drove back from Talkeetna that evening, and I sat at my desk and I wrote 2 full pages in the notebook without stopping, trying to get every word of that conversation down exactly as it had been spoken, because I understood by then that exact words were the only currency these cases would ever deal in. I still have those 2 pages. They are the most difficult thing in the notebook to read. The 5th case came 3 years after the 4th. I want to say it was the hardest one to work. The truth is, it was the hardest one to carry home afterward. And it is still the hardest one to put into words now, because the subject was 14 years old. I have thought carefully about how much to tell. I have decided to tell all of it, because partial truth is its own kind of dishonesty. And these cases deserve better than that. I have thought carefully about whether to include this case. Not because I am uncertain about what happened or what was reported to me. I am not uncertain about any of it. I have thought about it because the subject was a child, and because he is not a child anymore, and because somewhere out there is a grown man living his life who deserves to do that without his worst experience being attached to his name. So I will call him by his first name only, Marcus. He was 14 years old in September of 2006. He had been hunting with his father every fall since he was 8, same general area of the Tanana Valley, same father and son trip they had taken 6 years in a row. His father described him to me as a serious kid. Not serious in a troubled way. I'm serious in the way of a boy who paid attention to things and took his responsibilities to heart. He could read terrain. He knew his compass. He had his own field knife and he knew how to use it correctly, which his father mentioned with the specific quiet pride of a man who had taught his son something that mattered. They had been out for 2 days without incident when it happened. They were moving through a stretch of open ground in the early afternoon, good visibility, calm weather. His father stopped to glass a ridgeline about 400 yards ahead. He stood there for what he estimated as 2 minutes, maybe slightly less. When he lowered his binoculars and turned around, Marcus was gone. There was no sound, no call for help, no rustle of brush, nothing. I was first on scene. I ran the search personally, which I did not always do by that point in my career. But something in the father's voice on the radio made me get in the aircraft myself rather than coordinate from a desk. I cannot explain that instinct more precisely than that. I have learned not to require precise explanations from instincts that prove correct. We found Marcus 36 hours later, 6 miles northeast of the point where his father had last seen him. He was sitting on a flat rock at the edge of a spruce tree line, upright, hands resting in his lap, watching us approach with an expression I can only describe as unsurprised. Not vacant the way Gerald Pelham had been vacant, or standing in the particular wrong stillness of Nadia Voss. Present, aware, simply waiting, as if he had known we would arrive at approximately that time from approximately that direction. He was physically unharmed. Not a scratch. His boots were on and tied. His gear was intact. He was mildly hungry and accepted the food we gave him without urgency, eating slowly and deliberately the way a person eats when they are not particularly stressed, which was not the behavior of a 14-year-old boy who had spent 36 hours alone in the Tanana Valley. His father reached him about 20 minutes after we did, having been airlifted to our position. The reunion was what you would expect. The father barely holding himself together, the boy accepting the embrace with the patient steadiness of someone much older. I stood back and gave them the space it required and watched Marcus over his father's shoulder and thought, that is not the same boy who walked into this country 2 days ago. I interviewed him that evening, gently, hushed with his father present. Marcus, can you tell me where you went? I was following someone. Who were you following? He described the person. I will reproduce that description as accurately as I can, because accuracy is the only thing I have left to offer these cases. He said the person was tall, taller than his father, who was 6 feet 2. He said the person was thin, not thin like someone unhealthy. Thin like something that had never needed to be anything other than thin. He said the person's face was turned away for most of the time he was following. But when it turned toward him once, briefly, it had eyes that were too far apart and too large, and a color he had no name for. Not a color he had seen in any context he could compare it to. He said the person never spoke. It simply moved, and he followed it. And following it, felt, in his words, like the most natural thing he had ever done. Like something he had always been supposed to do, and was only now getting the chance to. I asked him how long he felt like he had been following the person. He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. Maybe an hour, maybe less. It had been 36 hours. I interviewed Marcus 2 more times over the following year, once at 3 months, once at 11 months. I drove to his family's home both times, sat at their kitchen table, drank his mother's coffee, and asked him to go through it again from the beginning. His father sat in the room both times. His mother, the second time. The account never changed. Not one detail. Not the height, not the thinness, not the color of those eyes that had no name, and not the feeling of following as the most natural thing he had ever done. Children's memories shift. They fill in gaps with what seems plausible. They absorb suggestions from the people around them. They round edges. Marcus did none of that. Every time he told it, it was the same story, word for word, detail for detail, delivered in the same quiet and certain voice. On my third visit, he walked me to my vehicle when I was leaving. He was 15 by then, taller than when I had first met him. You believe me, don't you? It was not a question. He already knew the answer. Yes, I believe you. He nodded once, as if that settled something he had been carrying for a year, got something from it, and walked back inside. I sat in that driveway for a few minutes before I started the engine. Then I drove home, and I wrote every word of it down. 5 cases, 4 decades. A notebook that went from 1 entry to 5 without me ever wanting it to grow. I have been asked what I think connects them, what I think was responsible, what I think the wilderness was doing with those people. I have thought about how to answer that, honestly, for a long time. I have been asked what I think these 5 cases were. What was in that field with Gerald Pelham? What took Raymond Stuckey and kept him? What Nadia Voss perceived in that clearing that her scientific mind could only file under breathing light? What Dennis Coho could not find words for and Patrick Eller ran from and never stopped running? Who Marcus followed for 36 hours through the Tanana Valley and felt entirely at peace doing it? I do not have an answer. I want to be honest about that rather than reach for one that fits. What I have instead is this. 31 years in the Alaskan wilderness taught me that certainty is the most dangerous thing a person can carry into remote country. More dangerous than poor gear. More dangerous than bad weather. The wilderness does not reward certainty. It rewards attention, humility, and the willingness to accept that you do not know what you are looking at. I still do not know what I was looking at. There is one thing I never wrote in the notebook. One detail I kept only in my head for 23 years. I am going to write it down now, tonight, when I finish this. Then, I am going to put the notebook back in the drawer and leave it there.